Hi, everybody. We are starting chapter 12 of chapter 12 of the Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne, and chapter 12 is called The Minister's Vigil. This chapter picks up exactly where chapter 11 left off. At the end of 11, Dimmesdale headed out the door, and at the beginning of chapter 12, he is outside walking wherever he was headed, and we're going to find out pretty quickly where that is. Walking in the shadow of a dream, as it were, and perhaps actually under the influence of a species of somnambulism, Mr. Dimmesdale reached the spot where now so long since Hester Prynne had lived through her first hours of public ignominy. Somnambulism is kind of like sleepwalking. It's like he's in this dreamlike trance, almost like he's half asleep. Of course, remember, he's been starving himself and whipping himself and depriving himself of sleep, so it wouldn't surprise us if he's half asleep. The same platform or scaffold, black and weather-stained with the storm or sunshine of 7 long years, and foot-worn, too, with the tread of many culprits who had since ascended it, remained standing beneath the balcony of the meeting-house. The minister went up the steps. So this tells us how much time has passed. This is the first, or not the first, but this is yet another definitive time marker. So it says that it's been 7 years since Hester was on the scaffold, and that's where he's headed, or that's where he's arrived. It was an obscure night of early May. An unvaried pall of cloud muffled the whole expanse of sky from zenith to horizon. If the same multitude which had stood as eye-witness while Hester Prynne sustained her punishment could now have been summoned forth, they would have discerned no face above the platform, nor hardly the outline of a human shape in the dark gray of the midnight. But the town was all asleep. There was no peril of discovery. The minister might stand there, if it so pleased him, until morning should redden in the east, without other risk than that the dank and chill night air would creep into his frame and stiffen his joints with rheumatism, and clog his throat with catarrh and cough, thereby defrauding the expectant audience of tomorrow's prayer and sermon. No eye could see him, save the ever wakeful one, which had seen him in his closet, wielding the bloody scourge. Why then had he come hither? Was it but the mockery of penitence? A mockery indeed, but in which his soul trifled with itself. A mockery at which angels blushed and wept, while fiends rejoiced with jeering laughter. He had been driven hither by the impulse of that remorse which dogged him everywhere, and whose own sister and closely linked companion was that cowardice which invariably drew him back with her tremulous gripe, just when the other impulse had hurried him to the verge of a disclosure. So it's the middle of the night, and it's dark out. It says that even if all those people that Hester had looking at her were there now, they wouldn't be able to see his face up on the scaffold. They'd barely be able to see an outline of someone standing there because, again, it's the middle of the night and it's dark. Poor miserable man. What right had infirmity like his, to burden itself with crime? Crime is for the iron-nerved, who have their choice either to endure it, or if it press too hard, to exert their fierce and savage strength for a good purpose and fling it off at once. This feeble and most sensitive of spirits could do neither, yet continually did one thing or another, which intertwined in the same inextricable knot the agony of heaven-defying guilt and vain repentance. So it's saying that Dimmesdale really isn't strong enough to be in the situation that he's in. He's not really built for this sort of struggle. And thus, while standing on the scaffold in this vain show of expiation, Mr. Dimmesdale was overcome with a great horror of mind, as if the universe were gazing at a scarlet token on his naked breast right over his heart. On that spot, in very truth, there was, and there had long been, the gnawing and poisonous tooth of bodily pain. Without any effort of his will or power to restrain himself, he shrieked aloud, an outcry that went pealing through the night, and was beaten back from one house to another and reverberated from the hills in the background. as if a company of devils, detecting so much misery and terror in it, had made a plaything of the sound, and were bandying it to and fro. "It is done," muttered the minister, covering his face with his hands. "The whole town will awake and hurry forth and find me here." But it was not so. The shriek had perhaps sounded with a far greater power to his own startled ears than it actually possessed. The town did not wake, or if it did, the drowsy slumberers mistook the cry either for something frightful in a dream, or for the noise of witches, whose voices at that period were often heard to pass over the settlements or lonely cottages, as they rode with Satan through the air. The clergyman, therefore, hearing no symptoms of disturbance, uncovered his eyes and looked about him. At one of the chamber windows of Governor Bellingham's mansion, which stood at some distance on the line of another street, he beheld the appearance of the old magistrate himself, with a lamp in his hand, a white nightcap on his head, and a long white gown enveloping his figure. He looked like a ghost evoked unseasonably from the grave. The cry had evidently startled him. At another window of the same house, moreover, appeared old Mistress Hibbins, the governor's sister, also with a lamp, which even thus far off revealed the expression of her sour and discontented face. She thrust forth her head from the lattice and looked anxiously upward. Beyond the shadow of a doubt, this venerable witch lady had heard Mr. Dimsdale's outcry and interpreted it, with its multitudinous echoes and reverberations, as the clamor of the fiends and night hags with whom she was well known to make excursions into the forest. So Dimsdale's up on the scaffold. It's the middle of the night. What does he do? He screams, he shrieks. It's like he can't help himself. And he sits and he waits for a second, expecting everyone to come out. They're all going to know. They're going to see him, and it'll be over. Instead, nothing happens. No one comes out. Maybe he didn't scream as loud as he thought he did, or maybe they just chalked it up to being the noise of witches that was typical of the time. But no one comes out to find him there. Detecting the gleam of Governor Bellingham's lamp, the old lady quickly extinguished her own and vanished. Possibly she went up among the clouds. The minister saw nothing further of her motions. The magistrate, after a wary observation of the darkness, into which nevertheless he could see but little further than he might into a millstone, retired from the window. The minister grew comparatively calm. His eyes, however, were soon greeted by a little glimmering light, which at first, a long way off, was approaching up the street. It threw a gleam of recognition on here a post, and there a garden fence, and here a latticed window pane, and there a pump with its full trough of water, and here again an arched door of oak, with an iron knocker, and a rough log for the doorstep. The Reverend Mr. Dimsdale noted all these minute particulars, even while firmly convinced that the doom of his existence was stealing onward in the footsteps which he now heard, and that the gleam of the lantern would fall upon him in a few minutes more and reveal his long-hidden secret. The light drew nearer. He beheld, within its illuminated circle, his brother clergyman, or, to speak more accurately, his professional father, as well as highly valued friend, the Reverend Mr. Wilson, who, as Mr. Dimsdale now conjectured, had been praying at the bedside of some dying man. And so he had. So Dimsdale's still up on the scaffold, and he sees a lantern coming from way down the street. And the lantern's getting closer and closer to him, and he's just standing there dreading, like, okay, here somebody comes. They're going to see me. The lantern's going to shine on me, and I'm going to be found. And then he realizes it's Reverend Wilson, who has been praying at the bedside of some dying man. The good old minister came freshly from the death chamber of Governor Winthrop, who had passed from earth to heaven within that very hour. Now, this is not the Governor Bellingham that we've heard about earlier in the book. Governor Winthrop was that's the name of an actual governor, so historical fiction here, a former governor of the colony who's just died. And now, surrounded like the saint-like personages of olden times with a radiant halo that glorified him amid this gloomy night of sin, as if the departed governor had left him an inheritance of his glory, or as if he had caught upon himself the distant shrine of the celestial city, while looking thitherward to see the triumphal pilgrim pass within its gates. Now, in short, good Father Wilson was moving homeward, aiding his footsteps with a lighted lantern. The glimmer of this luminary suggested the above conceits to Mr. Dimmesdale, who smiled, nay, almost laughed at him, and then wondered if he were going mad. As the Reverend Mr. Dimmesdale passed beside the scaffold, closely muffling his Geneva cloak about him with one arm, and holding the lantern before his breast with the other, the minister could hardly restrain himself from speaking. So it says, could hardly restrain himself. He doesn't actually say this part. A good evening to you, venerable Father Wilson. Come up hither, I pray you, and pass a pleasant hour with me. Good heavens! Had Mr. Dimmesdale actually spoken? For one instant he believed that these words had passed his lips, but they were uttered only within his imagination. The venerable Father Wilson continued to step slowly onward, looking carefully at the muddy pathway before his feet, and never once turning his head towards the guilty platform. When the light of the glimmering lantern had faded quite away, the minister discovered, by the faintness which came over him, that the last few moments had been a crisis of terrible anxiety, although his mind had made an involuntary effort to relieve itself by a kind of lurid playfulness. So once Wilson gets far enough away, Dimmesdale realizes just how nervous he was that he might be seen up there. Shortly afterwards, the grisly sense of the humorist stole in among the solemn phantoms of his thought. He felt his limbs growing stiff with the unaccustomed chilliness of the night, and doubted whether he should be able to descend the steps of the scaffold. Morning would break and find him there. The neighborhood would begin to rouse itself. The earliest riser, coming forth in the dim twilight, would perceive a vaguely defined figure aloft on the place of shame, and half crazed betwixt alarm and curiosity, would go knocking from door to door, summoning all the people to behold the ghost, as he needs must think it, of some defunct transgressor. Again, Dimmesdale is just imagining what it would be like. So he's kind of laughing at himself or at the thought that what if his joints go so stiff that he can't climb down off the scaffold and he just has to stand there until morning, and then the people will see him and know his secret. A dusky tumult would flap its wings from one house to another. Then the morning light, still waxing stronger, old patriarchs would rise up in great haste, each in his flannel gown, and matronly dames, without pausing to put off their night gear. The whole tribe of decorous personages, who had never heretofore been seen with a single hair out of their heads awry, would start into public view with the disorder of a nightmare in their aspects. Old Governor Bellingham would come grimly forth with his King James's ruff fastened askew, and Mistress Hibbins with some twigs of the forest clinging to her skirts, and looking sourer than ever, as having hardly got a wink of sleep after her night ride. And good Father Wilson, too, after spending half the night at a deathbed and liking ill to be disturbed, thus early out of his dreams about the glorified saints. Hither likewise would come the elders and deacons of Mr. Dimmesdale's church, and the young virgins who so idolized their minister, and had made a shrine for him in their white bosoms, which now, by the by, in their hurry and confusion, they would scantly have given themselves time to cover with their kerchiefs. All people, in a word, would come stumbling over their thresholds and turning up their amazed and horror-stricken visages around the scaffold. Whom would they discern there with the red eastern light upon his brow? Whom but the Reverend Arthur Dimmesdale, half frozen to death, overwhelmed with shame, and standing where Hester Prynne had stood. Again, this is all in Dimmesdale's mind as he's standing there, what it would be like if he just stands there all night until people come out and find him. Carried away by the grotesque horror of this picture, the minister, unawares and to his own infinite alarm, burst into a great peal of laughter. It was immediately responded to by a light, airy, childish laugh, in which, with a thrill of the heart, but he knew not whether of exquisite pain or pleasure as acute, He recognized the tones of little Pearl. So, as he thinks about this, remember he's very anxious, and for whatever reason, he starts laughing. Some people just laugh when they get nervous, I guess. I don't know. But he starts laughing, and when he laughs, he hears another voice, and he recognizes it as Pearl. Pearl, little Pearl, cried he after a moment's pause, then suppressing his voice, Hester Prynne, are you there? Yes, it is Hester Prynne, she replied in a tone of surprise, and the minister heard her footsteps approaching from the sidewalk along which she had been passing. It is I, and my little Pearl. Whence come you, Hester? Asked the minister. What sent you hither? I have been watching at a deathbed, answered Hester Prynne, at Governor Winthrop's deathbed, and have taken his measure for a robe, and am now going homeward to my dwelling. Come up hither, Hester, thou and little Pearl, said the Reverend Mr. Dimmesdale. Ye have both been here before, but I was not with you. Come up hither once again, and we will stand all three together. She silently ascended the steps and stood on the platform holding little Pearl by the hand. The minister felt for the child's other hand and took it. The moment that he did so, there came what seemed a tumultuous rush of new life, other life than his own, pouring like a torrent into his heart and hurrying through all his veins, as if the mother and the child were communicating their vital warmth to his half-torpid system. The three formed an electric chain. Minister, whispered little Pearl. What wouldst thou say, child? Asked Mr. Dimmesdale. Wilt thou stand here with mother and me tomorrow, noontide? Inquired Pearl. Nay, not so, my little Pearl, answered the minister, for with the new energy of the moment, all the dread of public exposure that had so long been the anguish of his life had returned upon him, and he was already trembling at the conjunction in which, with a strange joy nevertheless, he now found himself. Not so, my child. I shall indeed stand with thy mother and thee one other day, but not tomorrow. Pearl laughed and attempted to pull away her hand, but the minister held it fast. A moment longer, my child, said he. But wilt thou promise, asked Pearl, to take my hand and mother's hand tomorrow, noontide? Not then, Pearl, said the minister, but another time. And what other time? Persisted the child. At the great judgment day, whispered the minister, and strangely enough, the sense that he was a professional teacher of the truth impelled him to answer the child so. Then and there, before the judgment seat, thy mother and thou and I must stand together, but the daylight of this world shall not see our meeting. Pearl laughed again. But before Mr. Dimmesdale had done speaking, a light gleamed far and wide over all the muffled sky. It was doubtless caused by one of those meteors which the night watcher may so often observe burning out to waste in the vacant regions of the atmosphere. So powerful was its radiance that it thoroughly illuminated the dense medium of cloud betwixt the sky and earth. The great vault brightened like the dome of an immense lamp. It showed the familiar scene of the street with the distinctness of midday, but also with the awfulness that is always imparted to familiar objects by an unaccustomed light. So they're standing there, and I've already mentioned there's like this, I don't want to say fog, but it's cloudy, so that's why it's so dark. But the sky has lit up. All the clouds are lit up because it says there's a meteor streaking across the sky. The wooden houses with their jutting stories and quaint gable peaks, the doorsteps and thresholds with the early grass springing up about them, the garden plots, black with freshly turned earth, the wheel track little worn, and even in the marketplace margined with green on either side, all were visible, but with a singularity of aspect that seemed to give another moral interpretation to the things of this world than they had ever borne before. And there stood the minister, with his hand over his heart, and Hester Prynne, with the embroidered letter glimmering on her bosom, and little Pearl herself a symbol, and the connecting link between those two. They stood in the noon of that strange and solemn splendor, as if it were the light that is to reveal all secrets, and the daybreak that shall unite all who belong to one another. There was witchcraft in little Pearl's eyes, and her face, as she glanced upward at the minister, wore that naughty smile which made its expression frequently so elfish. She withdrew her hand from Mr. Dimmesdale's and pointed across the street, but he clasped both his hands over his breast and cast his eyes towards the zenith. So Pearl has pulled her hand away and she's pointing across the street. But Dimmesdale, who already had one hand over his heart, has now put the other hand over his heart and he's just looking up at the sky because it's like glowing. Nothing was more common in those days than to interpret all meteoric appearances and other natural phenomena that occurred with less regularity than the rise and set of the sun and the moon as so many revelations from a supernatural source. Thus, a blazing spear, a sword of flame, a bow, or a sheaf of arrows seen in the midnight sky prefigured Indian warfare. So, what this paragraph is talking about is that it was really common for people to see things in the sky and feel like it was a message from God about what was going to happen. So, if they saw a blazing spear, a sword of flame, a bow, or a sheaf of arrows, might tell them that they were going to have war with the Indians soon. So they believed in like messages from the heavens. Pestilence was known to have been foreboded by a shower of crimson light. We doubt whether any marked event for good or evil ever befell New England from its settlement down to Revolutionary times, of which the inhabitants had not been previously warned by some spectacle of this nature. Not seldom it had been seen by multitudes. Oftener, however, its credibility rested on the faith of some lonely eyewitness who beheld the wonder through the colored, magnifying, and distorting medium of his imagination and shaped it more distinctly in his afterthought. It was indeed a majestic idea that the destiny of nations should be revealed in those awful hieroglyphics on the cope of heaven. A scroll so wide might not be deemed too expansive for Providence to write a people's doom upon. The belief was a favorite one with our forefathers as betokening that their infant commonwealth was under a celestial guardianship of peculiar intimacy and strictness. But what shall we say when an individual discovers a revelation addressed to himself alone on the same vast sheet of record? In such a case, it could only be the symptom of a highly disordered mental state when a man, rendered morbidly self-contemplative by long, intense, and secret pain, had extended his egotism over the whole expanse of nature until the firmament itself could appear no more than a fitting page for his soul's history and fate. So again, it's still talking about the idea that people saw messages in the heavens, and it said that sometimes a lot of people might see the message, but more often than not, it would be like one person saw the message and they interpreted it and tell everybody else about it. But it says, what do you say when somebody sees a message that's just for them? It's like a message from the heavens directly to that person. We impute it, therefore, solely to the disease in his own eye and heart, that the minister, looking upward to the zenith, beheld there the appearance of an immense letter, the letter A, marked out in lines of dull red light. Not but the meteor may have shown itself at that point burning duskily through a veil of cloud, but with no such shape as his guilty imagination gave it, or at least with so little definiteness that another guilt might have seen another symbol in it. So as Dimmesdale is looking up at the sky, he swears that he sees what? A scarlet letter, of course, and he feels like it's a message from heaven directed right at him. There was a singular circumstance that characterized Mr. Dimmesdale's psychological state at this moment. All the time that he gazed upward to the zenith, he was nevertheless perfectly aware that little Pearl was pointing her finger towards old Roger Chillingworth, who stood at no great distance from the scaffold. The minister appeared to see him with the same glance that discerned the miraculous letter. To his features, as to all other objects, the meteoric light imparted a new expression, or it might well be that the physician was not careful then, as at all other times, to hide the malevolence with which he looked upon his victim. So in this light, when Dimmesdale looks at Chillingworth, he actually looks malevolent. He looks evil. Certainly, if the meteor kindled up the sky and disclosed the earth with an awfulness that admonished Hester Prynne and the clergyman of the day of judgment, then might Roger Chillingworth have passed with them for the arch-fiend, standing there with a smile and scowl to claim his own. So it's referring to Chillingworth as the devil again. Like if this were Judgment Day, it would look like he's the devil waiting to take those souls that he thinks he should win because of their sin. So vivid was the expression, or so intense the minister's perception of it, that it seemed still to remain painted on the darkness after the meteor had vanished, with an effect as if the street and all things else were at once annihilated. "Who is that man, Hester?" gasped Mr. Dimmesdale, overcome with terror. "I shiver at him. Dost thou know the man? I hate him, Hester." She remembered her oath and was silent. "I tell thee my soul shivers at him," muttered the minister again. "Who is he? Who is he? Canst thou do nothing for me? I have a nameless horror of the man." "Minister," said little Pearl, "I can tell thee who he is." "Quickly then, child," said the minister, bending his ear close to her lips. "Quickly, and as low as thou canst whisper." Pearl mumbled something into his ear that sounded indeed like human language, but was only such gibberish as children may be heard amusing themselves with by the hour together. At all events, if it involved any secret information in regard to old Roger Chillingworth, it was in a tongue unknown to the erudite clergyman, and did but increase the bewilderment of his mind. The elfish child then laughed aloud. So Dimmesdale is asking Hester if she knows who Chillingworth is because he's so creeped out by him. She doesn't say anything because remember, she promised. And Pearl says, "I know who he is. I'll tell you." Dimmesdale says, tell me fast." And he leans down and she just says some kind of gibberish. And then she laughs. "Dost thou mock me now?" said the minister. "Thou wast not bold. Thou wast not true," answered the child. "Thou wouldst not promise to take my hand and mother's hand tomorrow noontide." "Worthy sir," answered the physician, who had now advanced to the foot of the platform. "Pious Master Dimmesdale, can this be you? Well, indeed, we men of study whose heads are in our books have need to be straitly looked after. We dream in our waking moments and walk in our sleep. Come, good sir, and my dear friend, I pray you, let me lead you home." "How knowest thou that I was here?" asked the minister, fearfully. "Verily, and in good faith," answered Roger Chillingworth, "I knew nothing of the matter. I had spent the better part of the night at the bedside of the worshipful Governor Winthrop, doing what my poor skill might to give him ease. He's going home to a better world. I, likewise, was on my way homeward, when this strange light shone out. Come with me, I beseech you, reverend sir, else you will be poorly able to do Sabbath duty tomorrow. Aha! See now how they trouble the brain, these books. These books! You should study less, good sir, and take a little pastime, or these night whimsies will grow upon you." So Chillingworth obviously knows everything, right? But he plays it off right here like Dimmesdale was out sleepwalking, that he's just so tired, he's working too hard, and that he needs to be careful and take good care of himself. And so he's offering to help his friend get home so that he can preach in the morning, because tomorrow's Sunday. "I will go home with you," said Mr. Dimmesdale. With a chill despondency, like one awakening, all nerveless from an ugly dream, he yielded himself to the physician and was led away. The next day, however, being the Sabbath, he preached a discourse which was held to be the richest and most powerful and the most replete with heavenly influences that had ever proceeded from his lips. Souls, it is said, more souls than one, were brought to the truth by the efficacy of that sermon, and vowed within themselves to cherish a holy gratitude towards Mr. Dimmesdale throughout the long hereafter. But as he came down the pulpit steps, the gray-bearded sexton met him, holding up a black glove which the minister recognized as his own. "It was found," said the sexton, "this morning on the scaffold where evil-doers are set up to public shame. Satan dropped it there, I take it, intending a scurrilous jest against your reverence. But indeed he was blind and foolish, as he ever and always is. A pure hand needs no glove to cover it." "Thank you, my good friend," said the minister, gravely, but startled at heart, for so confused was his remembrance that he had almost brought himself to look at the events of the past night as visionary. So he almost convinced himself he imagined it. "Yes, it seems to be my glove indeed. And since Satan saw fit to steal it, your reverence must needs handle him without gloves henceforward," remarked the old sexton, grimly smiling. "But did your reverence hear of the portent that was seen last night? A great red letter in the sky, the letter A, which we interpret to stand for angel. For as our good Governor Winthrop was made an angel this past night, it was doubtless held fit that there should be some notice thereof." "No," answered the minister, "I had not heard of it." Okay, so after the night before, the next morning, Sunday, Dimmesdale goes on to preach an amazing sermon, like the best he's ever heard or anyone's ever heard. They love it. And then this twist at the end, the church sexton, which would be like the groundskeeper, hands him the glove, his own glove that he says was left on the scaffold, and the devil must have put it there to make you look bad. So you better handle him without gloves, as in, like, fight him. All right, recap of chapter 12. The minister, at the very beginning, ascends the scaffold. He screams, thinking he's finally going to get some relief. It's finally going to be over. His secret will be out. But it's the middle of the night, so no one hears, no one comes out. Pearl and Hester pass by. They, too, ascend the scaffold at Dimmesdale's request. Pearl ends up asking Dimmesdale if he'll stand with them the next day at noon. Dimmesdale says that he can't, that sometime he will stand with them, but it won't be tomorrow. He goes on to say that it will be Judgment Day. So we're hearing that yet again. We see some dark romanticism in the latter half of the chapter when the sky lights up and Chillingworth shows up all of a sudden, and there is this little bit of tension between them, but nothing really happens. You see the letter A in the sky, and then Chillingworth leads Dimmesdale home. We find out he preaches this wonderful sermon. They find his glove on the scaffold, and then also, of course, we also find out that the other townspeople also saw the Scarlet Letter A, so it wasn't just Dimmesdale. So what does that mean? We'll have to keep reading to find out.